Okay, our next speaker will be Melody Rose from the University of Tennessee Extension Service here in Greene County. And Melody is going to be talking about wildflowers. So it's going to be a continuation, basically, of Dr. Ceruta's presentation. And I don't think I need to introduce her anymore. I'm just going to let her come up and give her the rest of the time.
Okay, y'all. So did y'all learn some good stuff from Jennifer? Are you intrigued and turned on by a lot of things going on, all the different pollinator species we have available out there? They serve such a huge function. So we're going to kind of maybe do a deep dive and go a little bit more into the actual plants. So I was noticing from some of the questions y'all have, I hope I'm going to cover that. But before I get too deep into this, let me let y'all know that I do have a couple of websites that I maintain that I have extensive list for, I think, what you were asking a minute ago in regards to specific plants for pollen, specific ones just for the nectar sources and that kind of thing. So I'll be happy to share that with y'all. I don't have that embedded in the PowerPoint, but just send me an email at mtrose@utk.edu. and let me know you want that info, and I'll add you to that Google Drive or give you access to that website. Okay, so when we dive into the world, of course, of wildflowers, you've already heard Jennifer talk about the multitude of species that we're trying to increase in our home lawn and landscapes. And they range from everything, butterflies, ants, even birds. Okay, so when we talk about wildflowers, they're all going to serve that function. And I kind of chose that acronym WILD because wildflowers, they are wild, pretty much. They're also going to be indigenous. That's a word we're going to learn here in a few minutes. They're lovely, and then they're very distinctive. Okay, and it's all going to depend on our area and our personal preferences and personal philosophies as to what we're going to plant. So hopefully as we move through the next hour, you're going to kind of see different directions you can take with that. Now specifically we're going to focus on wildflowers, but keep in mind that we have a lot of flowers, ferns, mosses, mushrooms, trees, vines, and shrubs that we can also include in this topic because they too are going to produce flowers and can be a pollen or nectar source. So you can see there, you've heard Jen already talk about some of this because they are providing that sweet, sticky food for both us and for our vegetable crops, pollinating, all that good stuff. They are going to serve as a habitat for a lot of other beneficial insects, beneficial bugs. If you don't know the difference between the beneficials and the bad bugs, we've got some presentations on that as well that can kind of help showcase the populations of the good bugs we want to be drawing in to our environment. We have a lot of these flowers that we can plant intermittently in our gardens that are going to serve as companion plants. They're going to serve a multifunctional purpose. So for instance, I fight cucumber beetles every year. I have squash bugs every year. So you can plant things like nasturtiums, which are going to be a trap crop for squash bugs. If you're familiar with the plant tansy, that's one that can help repel cucumber beetles. So a lot of different things that you can utilize some of these different flowers for. And of course, they're going to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye, probably more than anything else. One thing to keep in mind, and Jen's kind of reviewed some of this as well, is that wildflowers are going to be buzzing through the seasons, y'all. It's not a summertime thing. This is something that we can promote throughout the year. Okay, so I like to mention in the springtime, we have those early spring ephemerals that start blooming. Many people will get out and start hiking the Smokies in the National Forest this time of year, and you'll see species like this, Dicentra. So squirrel corn, Dutchman's breeches, bleeding heart, all of those are going to be in that same family. And it's going to be one of the first pollinator plants that we see popping up. Of course, we have our summer sensations, and there's lots of different avenues that you can travel down with this. We all see those blooming prolifically now, and they're all serving a different purpose in our lawns, landscapes, and gardens. Again, it's just a matter of personal preference. A couple weeks ago, I did a talk on unique garden themes. So if you're into like moonlight gardens, you know, you can have all silver foliage plants with white blooms that are really scented, you know, different kind of things like that. But they're also going to serve the dual purpose of being pragmatic and working for you in the landscape. And of course, coming up here in just a few short weeks, we'll have the Joe Pye that you see here that'll be blooming, our fall friends. Jennifer mentioned goldenrod a little while ago, as well as the tall ironweed. Many of you might be considering those to be weeds, but they're actually going to serve a greater purpose. And then of course we finish up with what I call the winter warriors. So of course that looks dried and dead, and you just heard Jen talk about that. If you're OCD like me, you like a lot of order, it's kind of hard to leave this mess throughout the winter, but it actually is serving as a habitat for beneficials, for birds. It's a good food source. Plus, we get the reseeding happening as well. Many people will even mow off these wildflowers in the summertime, so you can also do that, and they're just going to continue to prolifically reproduce from year to year. Okay, just a little public service announcement on wildflowers. If you are thinking about purchasing a mix, and I'll just kind of throw this out here, I usually use American Meadows at home. Just be aware when you order those, again, this is going to be based on your personal philosophy, but if you are wanting to do 100% native in your landscape, make sure you read the fine print, because some of those mixes will not always just have what we want to grow here in western North Carolina or East Tennessee. Okay, so some of those can actually be sourced from the Midwest, the Western Coast, or even coming to us from other areas around the globe. So just be conscientious of that. For some it's not going to matter, but for some of you it might. Jen kind of mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about natives and invasive species and kind of what the difference is and kind of what we want to be doing in that regard to be able to bring in these high populations of pollinators. So when we talk about native, it kind of gets thrown around loosely, and there's lots of different ways that we can define that. But the biggest is just that it's a species that has evolved naturally in a region without human intervention. And this has been taking place for a long time. So even when our first ancestors came across the big pond and landed at Plymouth, they too brought plant species that we now consider native to this area. So even the dandelions that Jen was talking about, they were not native to U.S. soil. You know, those come from the old world. So kind of keep some of that in mind, but it's just about a matter of how they reproduce and they adapt to their climate and to their environment over time. So it's kind of like us, you know, we as people, I'm a native of Western North Carolina, but I've been in East Tennessee for 20 years. So regionally, you could say that I'm a North Carolina girl, but regionally, I'm from the Southern Appalachians. So when you start taking away those state boundaries, then we get some intermingling that starts occurring. So even though we speak native to East Tennessee, we're going to encompass a broader region than that. And hopefully I'm going to be able to illustrate that to you here in a few minutes. One example I want to use is think about the Cercis canadensis. We know that was first discovered in Canada, hence the canadensis, but that's our eastern redbud. So one way to kind of think about this is if you're in upstate New York and you purchase an eastern redbud and you bring it back to East Tennessee, it's a native species here, right? But those that have been grown and cultured in New York are not going to do quite as well here in our hot, humid summers in East Tennessee, even though they're still a native, if that makes sense. So always purchase locally the best you can. I'm going to pick on one back here because I know I always purchase my natives from Christy back there in the back. But make sure that you're purchasing from a reputable dealer that knows what they're doing when it comes to the natives. And I'm going to show you some things here in a few minutes. When you're looking at plants, you always want to be looking at the Latin. A lot of you are going to frown upon that. I know I used to do that myself, but when you look at that Latin, it's going to give you several clues. Okay, so you already heard me mention Cercis canadensis. When we see that in the Latin, we know that's native to here, to the eastern seaboard. If we see something like Lonicera japonica, what does that tell y'all? Where's it coming from? Japan. Right, so a lot of that Latin is going to kind of give us some inferences, especially when we move on in here in a few minutes and talk more about some of these invasive species. That's something we don't want to be cultivating here, that wild honeysuckle that we see growing so prolifically, even though it was introduced several decades ago as an ornamental, but now we know that it's starting to take over and encroach the world, and we're trying to get away from some of that. So I'm just encouraging you, when you do work with a native plant dealer, just make sure that you in fact know what they're growing and that they too know what they're growing. And there's some links in the PowerPoint that's going to lead you to that for all nurseries that are certified across the state, that you can find those locations no matter where you're at. Back to natives, just remember that they've got a lot of great things going for them. They're very adaptable. You're not going to have to worry as much about them as some of those, like Jen was talking about, some of those double-petaled flowers and this, that, knockout roses. We know the disease issues that we've had with those. Natives don't really have a lot of those disease and insect pressures like we see with a lot of our hybrids and new cultivars and even some of our nativars. And it's not to say we can't use those and plant those and incorporate those. It just means we need to be careful with what we have going on in our own landscape and how to use all these and tie those together more efficiently. One of the big ones that I like is that they're cheap. They're really easy to get started, super easy to maintain. And it's just phenomenal. You saw pictures. I don't have a lot of the pictures that Jen had of all of these flowers together, intermingled in the meadows and things like that, because I'm going to show you individual pictures here in a few minutes. But they're really super to maintain. Some people will actually mow those off in the fall. Some people just leave them for the wildlife through the winter. Again, it just kind of depends on what you're going for. So I like to call them the true conservationists. This is something that we're doing now. We're taking those steps to preserve our own legacy and pass that on for future generations. We're just maintaining sustainability. And then of course, we know that they serve as wildlife habitats, refuges, and shelters. And again, that's for a multitude of pollinator species. So it's all about interconnection and creating and building that biodynamic ecosystem. Just a few terms to throw at you. Indigenous, you kind of heard me mention that a minute ago. We'll often use that synonymously with the term native, but neither one is going to really tell us where that plant's native. So that's why it goes back to understanding the Latin and where that true plant originated from. If you see an endemic species, and we have one that you see pictured there, the Echinacea tennesseeensis, which is our Tennessee coneflower, it's endemic to one area of the state, and what that means is that you're only going to find it in 3 counties in Middle Tennessee on the Cedar Glades. Lebanon, Tennessee, Wilson County, if you're familiar with that area, that's where you're going to see this plant. Not to say that you can't grow it here, you certainly can, but it's kind of special to know that that's an endemic plant to Tennessee. Again, just when you're creating your landscape, thinking about employing some of these tactics, just remember the more that you can purchase local, the better that's going to be. These wildflowers and native species can withstand a lot of extreme temperature swings, from drought to flood. If we get a massive flood in the springtime, oftentimes for these native species, it's not going to really matter. They're pretty well going to bounce back. Same if we get into a dry period. Now, they may look ugly for a little while, but they're still going to proliferate and keep reproducing time and again for us. Whoops. Okay, so this is the website I was talking about. I did put it in the PowerPoint here. So this is just where you can find multiple sources of native plants and seeds in the state of Tennessee. So make sure you check that link out. And like I say, we have several right here. Again, I'll pick on Christy because I know she does a great job with what she does with natives, because I think anything that I've purchased comes pretty much from her and our local folks here in the county. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about natives and kind of putting the puzzle, I guess, together. We live in a really special area here in southern Appalachia when we start talking about the flora and the fauna, because we live in, when I talk about the southern Appalachians, I'm talking about anything from southwest New York all the way down to Alabama and Mississippi. So what we term that is a non-glaciated area. So what does that mean and why does that matter? Well, a lot of the plant species that we see existing here right now, even though we didn't have glaciers, we still have some of the remnants of that, especially when we get to higher elevations above 5,500 feet. So what I'm saying is that we can really grow an extensive amount of native plants in our landscape, because just here within the southern Appalachians, we have about 2,000 species that are 100% native to this region. again, from southwest New York down to Alabama and Mississippi. Within that 2,000, we have 200 that are wholly confined just to this area within the Great Smokies and extending out. So that includes this region here. That's pretty cool when you think about it, because, you know, when we travel around the U.S., not to take away from anywhere else, I've been fortunate to get to travel quite a bit, but I'm always anxious to come home, not just to see those mountains, but all the plants and the wildlife that go with it, because we've got about 200 species that nobody else is going to be able to grow, which is really cool. Because of all of that, you'll notice there that we're considered one of the great floral provinces of Earth, because we're networked into this interdependent system. So just a couple examples, the Rhone Highlands up at Rhone Mountain. We all know that the second weekend in June, usually we have the Rhododendron Festival, the CATAWBA rhododendron, a native species there. You notice the flower, we don't necessarily consider it a wildflower, but it's a native shrub. And if you have the proper pH in your landscapes, you know, it can serve as a species that can draw certain pollinator species in. Another thing when we're talking about the great floral provinces is to remember, some of you that have taken some of my other classes, kind of goes back to the scenario I was using with the redbud. You've often heard me say, if you're hiking in the Smokies or National Forest, you don't want to be poaching our native orchids like the pink lady slippers or the yellow lady slippers. And number one, it's just not right to do that. It's not ethical to dig that up and remove it from its native zone. That's a personal opinion for me. But number two, if you move that, you're disturbing that mycorrhizae fungi, which exists in the soil, and it's formed this relationship with its native environment. So if you move it from its proper place, from its home, you're probably not going to have success at your house when you transplant that thing. So just kind of keep that in mind. We have a lot of relationships that are occurring even below the soil line that maybe many folks are not quite aware of. And it's not to say you can't get those started in your own landscape. It just requires a little bit of time and patience. About 7 years, y'all, for the pink lady slipper, just as an FYI. Also remember that we have many species of ferns and mosses, mushrooms that you can incorporate as well, not so much as being a pollinator plant, but don't forget those as well. Just to kind of speak to the Appalachian region again and why it is so important, many of our cove hardwood forests, we get a lot of understory plants that provide good shelter. They're good nectar sources, and we can recreate those same kind of environments in our own home landscape. So if you've ever been to the chimney tops in Gatlinburg, to the picnic area, and you're looking up at the chimneys, there's a cove hardwood trail there. That's an excellent example of what I'm talking about there. You can see all those species coexisting. And then that coniferous spruce fir forest, that's what I'm referring to from the non-glaciated area. So anytime we get above that 5,500, 6,000 feet, you can incorporate some of those conifer species as well. So you've heard Jennifer talk about why natives or why pollinators are so important, and why natives, how they can contribute to that. And of course, it's pollinating our crops and our natural vegetation. That's going to be the biggie. Seed dispersal is really critical. You know, if you start planting some of these wildflower seeds or any of these native flowers, a little dab will do you to get started. You don't need to buy in masses, because eventually they're going to proliferate and reproduce on their own. And they have their own mechanisms in place to be able to do that. It's pretty cool, like you see here with the seed dispersal. One of the other big things with Greene County being a tremendous ag county, we're number 2 in livestock production currently. We used to be big in burley tobacco. And what that means is when we are on a big production ag scale, then that means we have a lot of monocultures in place. There's nothing wrong with that, because less than 2% of our nation's farmers are feeding the world, right? So we have to have that in place. But what you can do in your own backyard, in your own home gardens, is create these biodynamic ecosystems. And we're going to help balance out those pest populations. And so you can kind of see there on the balance beam with production ag and with our home gardens how we can do that. That's just incorporating companion plants and creating those habitats for our pollinators to come in. And Jen talked a lot about this with just pollinators and why it's so important, but just a couple more to mention there is that, again, they can moderate temperature extremes, and you're going to see why that's so important um, in, in, um, in regard to invasives and why they don't do that. And then protecting our water's edge, okay, that last bullet point, number 11. That's going to be really important, especially for places here in Greene County because we have so much flowing water in the county. So we want to preserve and protect that as much as we can. Another thing real quick, just to kind of showcase planting wildflowers and creating this habitat, is to remember that all of these plants are going to tell a story. It's not going to be the same story for every one of you in here, but most of you are probably here because you like plants. Some may have a more pragmatic approach, but you're trying to maybe make your place prettier, you're trying to build up a pollinator habitat, you're trying to draw in good bugs, whatever the case may be. But overall, you're probably going to select those plants that you're going to put in your home landscape based on a sense of nostalgia from the past, plants that are going to evoke a certain emotional response. So I kind of put a few up here just to kind of highlight what I'm talking about there. Our Tennessee state wildflower is the passionflower. So this has a story tied to it from Christian missionaries that were traveling through South America in the 16th century. And they tied this story to the death of Jesus Christ. So that's why the passionflower, each one of those plant parts actually represent a part of Jesus' death on the cross. So for some, it might be a religious type belief. Jen mentioned goldenrod a few minutes ago. A lot of people get wound up about goldenrod, y'all, this time of year because everybody says it makes you sneeze. It can't make you sneeze. It's this one that makes you sneeze, the one I just popped up there. That's ragweed. The cool thing about goldenrod is that the pollen is too heavy. It can't be carried by wind. So goldenrod is great, y'all. Don't fuss at goldenrod. Plus, it's really pretty mixed in a meadow with Joe Pye and that tall ironweed I was talking about. But it also evokes a certain sense of nostalgia for some populations. We go back to our Cherokee. They called this plant woundwort because it healed everything. So for them, it's a matter of just maintaining a custom. Same thing with the Cree Indians. This is one that they named Pipsissewa, which is wintergreen. So it too was known to break up kidney stones and things like that. So it's just tying certain stories to the area. Same with chicory. This became a coffee additive at first. When the blockades lifted in Louisiana, we know they continued on with the tradition of chicory. They would either use it as an additive or they used it as a caffeine-free replacement. So again, we're tying that to our historical origins. Plus, we know a lot of ancient philosophers use this just as a source of inspiration for all of their writings and such. I'm not advancing. Why am I not advancing? There we go. And then this one is probably one of my favorites. Of course, it's not a wildflower, but again, it's telling that story. Y'all know what this is? Come on now. Somebody shout it out. Lori Grabner, what is that plant? Ramps. Let me get my thingy going. It's like I'm on a lag here. Okay, so ramps. If you're from this area, then you know all about ramps, right? But not only that, it's got some historical origins because our early settlers actually used that as a blood detoxifier. It was the first thing that poked through in the springtime, and they would use that to give them energy to move through the season. And then same thing in northern Appalachia, the ostrich fern, the fiddleheads up there. So kind of the same thing. They just tell a story. Uh-oh, did you speed that up on me? Okay, so what is an invasive species? Let's shift gears a little bit, and we're going to speak to a few of these so you can kind of, again, we're putting that puzzle piece together. If you hear the term invasive or you hear the term non-native, alien, or exotic, all of those are kind of synonymous with one another. That's typically going to mean that's a plant species we don't want necessarily in our landscape. This is just a really quick schematic to kind of show you invasives on the right, natives on the left. You can kind of see those plant structures and growing habits are going to be really similar. But some here in Tennessee in the Exotic Pest Council, we're going to consider those a tier 1 or a rank 1 threat to our natural ecosystems. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, don't worry. But a prime example of this, as far as invasive species, what is this? Oh my gosh, I got like 30 answers. Hallelujah. How many of you like this tree? Do I have a tomato I can throw at someone that says yes? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, this is a really bad beast right here. It too was brought into the U.S., introduced primarily as a rootstock. This is a calorie pear, okay, and then the sign wood ornamental uses is where it got its name, Bradford. But what happened? Initially when it was brought in here, we thought it was sterile, right? It's not. It hybridizes freely with everything else, and then it gets dropped by the birds, and this is what we end up with, are all these calorie pears. And guess what? They don't serve a purpose. They're not pretty. If you ever grow them in your landscape, you know they have weak notches and the wind's going to blow them down at nothing. So this goes back to making sure that you know what species that you want to plant, especially if you're a new homeowner and you're thinking about trees, because even though we're talking about wildflowers, lots of trees have blooms, right? What's the bad thing about a Bradford? They smell like rotten fish when they do bloom, right? So I personally don't want that growing in my yard. But as they start to self-hybridize freely, then we get these thorns, so they make handling them a lot more difficult too. Lots of other invasive species, I'm not going to go into that. Winter creeper, privets, Johnson grass, there's many to name. So if you're interested in that, so you don't make the wrong plant purchases when you're thinking about planting some wildflowers, shrubs, or trees, I have those available for you at the office. I can send you a link to those. So just reach out and I'll make sure you get that. When we do talk about invasives, there's a lot of liabilities that can go along with that. So that's another reason it's really important. Just if a neighbor knowingly plants an invasive, then that could be means for them suing you, or you suing them, or vice versa. We also have economic considerations. Think about the U.S. Forest Service and how much money they spend each year in maintaining right-of-ways, or utility companies for right-of-ways. And what are they using to maintain those right-of-ways? Pretty stout herbicides, right? And I mean, that's a tool. Unfortunately, when we get these invasives started, it's not a 1 year fixes all. Once we get the creation of these established, it's really hard to enter into a relationship with them. It's something you're going to be doing ongoing as far as trying to eradicate that species and get natives or even the native hybrid cultivars started in your landscape. So that's kind of what that means. We've already talked a little bit about ethical, and then as far as the ecology, you've heard Jen mention all of this. It all comes back to everything living in harmony in our own landscapes. Just a reminder, people, we can either bring in the good stuff or the bad stuff. We're the #1 carrier for whatever we do bring into our area, into our region. So that's why, again, do your research, know what you're bringing into your own personal landscape. Remember that even with forest fires, a lot of controlled burns are going to actually help with seed dispersal. I know Barry does a lot of burning off with some of his for wildlife plots and such. So we're going to have that fire in order for a lot of these species to reproduce. You know, but we have to be careful when we're out and about, because it's not just fire that causes some of these disturbed areas. Anything that disturbs. Think about how many houses are going up now. Anywhere we get a bare area, what's the first thing going to pop in its place? Not these great plants that are going to be bringing in the pollinators that Jen spent an hour talking to y'all about. They're going to be bad. They're going to encroach out everything else. So as we jump, we're going to talk about planting. Jen talked about how to prepare your ground for that. If we are planting just wildflower seeds, I do this in the fall. I don't like to have to compete in the springtime with weeds, and I don't like to have to water all the time. I travel a lot, so it's really hard for me to make sure everything gets adequately watered, and Mother Nature can sometimes be undependable, right? So if you do this in the fall, do it after you get a couple of hard frosts, and do it just like you would in the springtime. Basically, what you're going to get out of that is you're not going to have to water as frequently, and you're going to get about a 2-week jump on your wildflowers in the springtime. So I would highly suggest that for this area. Jen was talking about doing plots. She's got a grant, I've got a grant. We're getting ready to roll out with some plot work out at the research center. So hopefully you're going to get to see a lot of this in action. Mine don't go in till later this fall, but it's a 3-year grant, so hopefully you're going to get to see a lot of this that we've been talking about today. When I was trying to figure out what plants, what wildflowers to show y'all, I was like, oh my Lord, y'all know how many plants there are in the universe? A lot. So I tried to go through and pick out some that maybe are a little bit different. just so you can have an idea of how it would maybe fit in your own landscape. There's going to be multiple pictures of some, single pictures of others. And you kind of see there, I didn't pick some of the ones that I think most people would probably know from this region. But there's going to be a lot that you're going to recognize as well. I'm kicking us off with one called LOOSESTRIFE. This is going to be kind of a spring ephemeral into a summer blooming plant. The reason I chose this is it's almost endemic itself. It's a very rare species, but you can get it started. I actually have this at my house. But if anybody's been to Cloudland Canyon down in Chattanooga, this is one that grows pretty prolifically down there. Now, its distant cousin is the purple loosestrife, and I guarantee you all of you here in the room have seen that. That is a tier 1 or rank 1 plant that's on our invasive species list. So I kind of chose that one to just show it is a little bit different bloom on the plant, but it is a native species and performs really well in the area. This is one that's kind of cool that comes on late spring into the early summer, the CRANEFLY orchid, but it is a great pollinator plant. It's kind of unique. And don't worry, in the notes of these slides is where you can purchase these as well locally. And like I say, Christy has a lot of these, I know, in supply. BACHELOR'S button, if you order American Meadows seed mixes, this is one that's pretty prolific. We actually had this in our home garden veggie trials this year. BACHELOR'S button's so named because back in the day they would pick the flower and stick it in the buttonhole. So it has a lot of historical origins to it as well. Once this gets started, you just need a few seeds. If you don't want to do it in a wildflower mix, you can do them just in a single pack, and you'll have a mass like this usually within a year. So they're really great. They take off great for this area. Multiple species of rudbeckia, or the black-eyed Susan, or the brown-eyed Susies, whatever you want to call those. You can also use this even in wildlife plots, along with sunflowers and wild daisies. I think I've got a picture of that in here as well. But these are pretty prolific, and they grow really nicely in our area. You heard Jen mention this one a few minutes ago, the Gaillardia, or the blanket flower. I think it was even New Mexico that actually chose their school colors based on this plant. So this is one that flourishes across the U.S. It grows in masses, and you can kind of see there, and you heard her tell you it does in fact serve as a great pollinator plant as well. And you can get different cultivars of that. Butterfly weed, and here's another distinction just to make mention, and it's not to say you're bad if you plant butterfly bush. There is a difference. How many knew there was a difference between the bush and the weed? Okay, we got some in here. There is a difference. The butterfly bush is actually going to be on that rank 1 too, considered an invasive species. The butterfly weed is going to be a great food source for our monarch butterflies. It's going to have that white milky sap. This is one, if you try to transplant it from a pasture field, then you probably haven't had much great success with that either, just due to its interdependent relationships as well. So hard to move, but an excellent monarch food source. And you can kind of see there how they feed on that. Cardinal flower, if you have wet areas, swampy areas in and around your landscape, this is a really cheap one to get started. It'll grow really nice in those wet, marshy areas. And you'll notice there it too is a great food source for hummingbirds. Now here's an FYI, butterflies don't always see the color red. So if you go out and plant this massive field of red wildflowers, you're not going to have a lot of butterflies. I mean, you might have a few, but they don't see that very good, whereas the hummers are going to see that really nicely. So when you do start planting some of those wildflower mixes, make sure you're getting a lot of different colors, a lot of diversity in those seed mixes. And you can kind of see how that masses out as well. I've already mentioned the CATAWBA rhododendron. Of course, we're talking about wildflowers, but you have to consider that these are going to serve a purpose as well in our landscape. The flame azalea, just to show you a couple of pictures there, especially if you have a lot of shade or if you have like rocks, you're wanting to build that area up. They are going to draw in the pollinators. You're going to have large populations of birds and butterflies and even the bees to eat on those as well. And you can see the different colors there. The big thing is just to make sure that you got a low pH before you plant these. I put the Indian pipes in, even though they're not technically really a great pollinator source, but if you can get those started, they're kind of cool just to have growing in the landscape. They lack chlorophyll, so they can't produce food for themselves. They eat on the dirt and the mulch and the debris and things like that. We've already talked about chicory. I'll skip over that one. COREOPSIS or tick seed, that's another great pollinator plant. Oftentimes you're going to find that in a lot of these wildflower meadow mixes as well. Robbie, you just got to tell me on time. Okay. Echinaceas, any of the coneflowers, and this is where we get into so many different of the native species. There's just a humongous list of these, various different colors, but you can kind of see there how pronounced. I'm not as good on my lingo as Jen is when it comes to what that is in the center there. My brain just died. But anyway, you can see how they would be an excellent food source. And there's our Tennessee coneflower, and you can kind of see the petals on it are a little bit more spread out than the typical echinacea. So it makes it a little bit more distinctive and is a good talking point in your own landscape. Golden Alexander, you'll see this blooming in the springtime. Pretty prolific with butterflies all season long. It's really easy to get started, especially if you like the color yellow. And golden aster, you heard Jen mention these. These are going to be coming on in the late summer, so they're going to be an excellent nectar source for all of our pollinators during that time. And here's the purple aromatic aster, and you can kind of see how dense of a bush that it does in fact form. Indian pinks, a lot of people like these just because they're unique, and they are in fact unique to the area. Plus hummingbirds love those as well. This is one that's kind of cool, goat's rue. You heard Jennifer talking about cover crops. This one could almost be a cover crop because it is a legume. It's a member of the Fabiaceae family, but it's got a really cool pink bloom on. Whoa, 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 whoa. I have no idea what happened. Okay. Oh, we got a lot to go back through. I don't know if I'll get through all these or not. Where was I at? Lord, I just got myself all shook up. Oh my gosh, there's a lot in here, y'all. I don't like this clicker, Robbie. It's not being very nice. Okay. How about we start with that? Yeah, because I'm going to have to move on time anyway. Okay, did y'all shut your eyes for that backwards review? Okay, you've heard me mention ironweed. This one's just fresh on my mind because it's getting ready to start blooming right now along with the goldenrod and the Joe Pye. A lot of folks think it's a weed. It starts coming up. It looks a lot like mare's tail, as you can see there from the foliage, but it is a really great pollinator source, and it grows too well in swampy areas. It gets really tall. It gets even taller than me in some places. And there's your Joe Pye, again, intermingled. We have a lot of different nativars to this as well, so you don't have to just rely on our old standby euphorbia. There's lots of different species of that as well. Lots of different colors too, so it's not necessarily just the bright purple. If you're more into the light pinks or even the lilacs, we have those as well. Queen Anne's lace, this is what we call the wild carrot, so they're going to serve a multi-purpose, but excellent pollinator source. It used to be called chiggerweed. A lot of people think chiggers are chiggers. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure this out. If they're true bugs that bury under your skin or if they're just the bites. I don't know. Huh? Okay. All right. Our nurse here says that they do burrow. Okay. Jewelweed. This is one of my favorites. If you have a pond or stream bank area, it's going to grow really nicely. This is our wild impatiens, touch-me-nots. This is a great remedy for poison ivy. So usually anywhere you have poison ivy growing, the remedy is going to be growing real close. You see Darlene here in the green shirt nodding her head yes, because she's been eat up with poison ivy. That's why I have Band-Aids all around my ankles. I got into it myself last weekend. So I have just a little bit more jewelweed salve to rub all over myself, and I'm going to have to make some more of that. But this is an excellent one, easy one to get started, y'all. Comes in both orange and yellow colors. Larkspur, this is a delphinium. You're seeing this bloom now. Real dainty flower along with the milkworts. I'm afraid to hit this too hard. Nodding ladies tresses, this is kind of a cool one to be intermingling. You can kind of see, it looks kind of like a lily. It's foliage. It puts out that long spike. And I'm not going into a lot of the stories and stuff like that. I just want to spend some time showing you the various different kinds of flowers you can have, kind of depending on what your preference is. We have the oxeyes and the Shasta daisies, both of which are composites, going to be great pollinators. We've already talked about the passion flower. I think I probably got a few pictures in here. There's even a yellow passion flower, y'all. It's almost chartreuse in color, so it's kind of a cool throwback to the passion flower. Penstemons, these come on in early spring, early summer, or late spring, early summer. Sometimes you'll hear it called beard's tongue. Lots of different names for a lot of these. That goes back to how you always want to make sure you're using the Latin. Different colors of that too. Pink turtlehead, I put that one in just as a fluke. A lot of people are not familiar with that plant, but it grows really nicely in rock gardens and serves as a great pollinator source as well. Same thing with the Indian plantain. If you're into some odd and eccentric type plants, it's kind of got a personality all of its own. Just to make mention, don't kill that plantain in your yards either, y'all. That's a good plant to have for a lot of specific uses. If you're interested, just ask me afterwards and I'll tell you. This is SKULLCAP. It grows really nicely in the shade. Also will grow in around wet areas, swampy areas. Southern FLAREBELL. Lots of different types of flowers. I hope y'all are seeing that. When we talk about all these, oh, I got 5 minutes. Okay, I got to run. Here we go. Sweet Williams, we can plant those as annual seed packs. Like Jen was saying earlier, when we go to preparing our ground to plant a lot of these wildflower seeds, we don't want to be competing with the weeds. So if you've got some holes that maybe didn't come up if you plant these in the spring, or if you plant them in the fall and you have some vacated areas, come back in with some annual mixes just to fill in until we can get enough proliferation from them reseeding themselves from the perennials. Tick trefoil, which is kind of cool. It too is a member of the Fabiaceae family. This is TURK'S cap. We got a couple of different lilies that look like this. If you're familiar with André Michaud, sometimes we'll refer to this as his lily. It was so named because he sang the French national anthem at top Grandfather Mountain when the Declaration of Independence was being sung. So kind of a cool lily in and around the area of Roan Mountain. Gets very large, but it's a cool one to have. Wild columbine, same thing. We've got a lot of different species of the columbine, but our native is going to have that red with the yellow tinge. That's one way we can tell our native from all the different cultivars that have been created. Many people will even have the purple color and consider that to be native, but to my knowledge, this is the only actual native species. You heard Jen talk about the 4 o'clocks. They open up at 4 o'clock. And we have some other plants that kind of have that same kind of activity going on. The celandine poppies, they come on early in the spring, and they're open during the day, whereas an evening primrose is going to look pretty much just like this plant, but it only is going to open up in the nighttime. So we have a lot of those plants available as well, like the moon, the trumpet, what is that called? I don't have trumpet flower. Those blooms open at night, release that scent, but they close during the day and fall off. It's pretty cool. I've already mentioned the dicentra species, but don't forget your spring ephemerals. If you've got a shady area that can support these to thrive, they're excellent pollinators and plants to have in place early in the season. Same thing with purple fringe PHACELIA. After the Gatlinburg fires, if you've ever been from, again, Chimney Tops all the way up to Clingman's, if you saw the purple proliferation on both sides of the road, that's the purple fringe PHACELIA. Well, after the wildfire, what was the first thing that come back? So fire's not always a bad thing. It was the first plant to rebloom after all of that. A lot of our trilliums, the stinking benjamins, the wake robins, all of those, shooting stars, different colors of those as well. And even though some of these are hard to get started and you have to be a little bit patient for them to bloom for you, they're going to be well worth it, and then they just spread pretty rampantly on their own. Twin leaf, if you're into historical origins, this is Thomas Jefferson's plant, so named Jeffersonia diphylla. Norris Lake has an abundance of these. I don't like to poach, but I did take one from there. I'll just go ahead and confess. And it done quite nicely at home, but you know, always ask permission before you do that. And then I'll just leave you with wood sorrel. Some of those are going to be really good to have as pollinator plants as well. So hopefully you can see from some of this that there's just a whole gamut of different kinds of flowers. It's not just about sowing the wildflower seed, y'all. It's also about planting a lot of our natives or nativars, which is just cultivars of our native species. They might just be a different color. But remember, these natives are going to thrive in these regions because that's what they've done for years and years. It'd be taking one of us Southern Appalachians out and sending us over the big pond of Croatia. It's going to take us a little while to fit in, right? So kind of the same type thing with some of these plants. I'm out of time, ain't I?
You're right on cue.
Okay, well, I'll just end with this one right here. This is the honeysuckle that's native. So that yellow viney stuff you see growing around your property, that's the japonica. That's the one we don't want. That's posing a major threat to our natural habitats. So if you get the opportunity, plant this one instead. Okay, any questions from anybody? I know that's a lot of information. Yes.
Hang on a minute.
I think he asked me where you can buy seed.
Oh, okay.
Was that all? Okay. I like American Meadows because you can kind of create your own seed mix. And I've actually called them a couple times on the phone and chatted with them to make sure that I'm getting seed just specifically for this region and area. You can buy pre-mixes as well that are going to be, they're going to run the gamut there too. 100% annual seed mix to 100% perennial. You can buy colored mixes. You can get cover crops interdispersed with that. So really check those out. They've got some really good tips on preparing your ground and that kind of thing too. American Meadows.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Is there supposed to be a list in here of a bunch of things? You made a comment.
I have a lot of lists in a Google Drive and on a website. So if you write my email down and flip me an email and kind of let me know what you're interested in, and I'll get you pointed in the right direction. It's mtrose@utk.edu. And I know that we got some people that belong to that, Darlene, Lori, Christy back there. So there's a lot of information in there, specifically handouts with invasives, with the natives, perennial blends, all kinds of good stuff like that. So just let me know what you're after and we'll make sure you get it.
All these species that you're talking about, native plants and so forth, how do they relate to animals in terms of my cattle going to eat up these and get sick? Goats going to die if they get into this stuff? How do these native plants relate to?
You need to tune into my class next Monday night because I'm talking about toxic plants. Really, for real. Jen, I don't know if I know we have a list just for livestock, for beef cattle, but I don't know if it's going to be for goat and
That's
sheep.
actually a comment I was just going to make is because rhododendrons came up twice, and so rhododendrons are actually poisonous for honeybees. So if you are planting for honeybees, do not plant rhododendrons, and the honey that gets produced from it has been shown to have negative impacts on humans. So there's just a lot of chemistry that's involved in these plants.
See, I didn't know that. I learned
that.
that.
No, worry. I mean, that's the thing. It's oftentimes these toxic plants, it's really hard for us to figure out what the cause is because the bees are foraging on so many different types of things. Yeah. But like thistles and stuff can be problematic for a lot of the horses and cows. I know out in California, the yellow star thistle, great for bees, terrible for livestock. And then we run into some issues too with some of these plants that we like for honey, but aren't good for the environment. So there's actually a publication. I can send it to Melody if you want to send it to folks who request for it about toxic nectars out in the environment. But yeah, it's a hard field to narrow down. Even when people have toxic reactions or reactions to toxic honey, you have to cancel out everything else in their diet, which is really hard to do. But yeah, rhododendrons, not for honeybees, maybe for other bees, but definitely not for honeybees.
And that's the other thing is just going back and doing your own research. What affects you? You know, some people, just like me talking about poison ivy, that's not going to be an issue for some people. But there's going to be some plants, even like rue. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's going to cause skin irritations with a lot of people. So it goes even beyond what you're talking about with cattle. Just like multiflora rose, you know, that was introduced to be a living fence row, and now look what kind of, you're trying to kill it now in those fence rows instead of it being the fence row, you know. So a lot of things we learned in the 1930s, here we are like, whoops, kudzu, you know, great erosion control, but, you know, it's eating up the South, so. But yeah, y'all reach out, send me an email, and we'll get you more information. As you can see, it's the complexity of building a biodiverse ecosystem in your home landscape. There's a lot to it. It's not just a one fix or one step fix all. It's a process. mtrose@utk.edu. I'm going to leave this up here for the next speaker.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, Melody, thank you very much.